In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a single gunshot shatters the calm as the despised Colonel Prothero is found dead in the vicar's study. A cryptic note, a tampered clock, and a web of lies point to a scandalous lover's plot between the Colonel's widow, Anne, and artist Lawrence Redding. As young Lettuce hides a guilty secret and the mysterious Mrs. Lestrange watches from the shadows, Vicar Leonard Clement and the sharp-eyed Miss Jane Marple unravel a chilling conspiracy of love and betrayal. Who pulled the trigger, and what truths lie buried in this quiet village? Dive into the murder at the vicarage where every clue hides a darker secret. Chapter 1. The disagreeable Colonel. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its tidy cottages and winding lanes, seemed an unlikely stage for tragedy. Yet, as I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this unassuming parish, sat at my breakfast table, a sense of unease hung over me like a morning mist. Colonel Lucius Prothero, a man whose very name provoked sighs or frowns depending on the listener's temperament, had once again inserted himself into my thoughts. His latest grievance was the state of the church accounts, which he insisted on auditing with the zeal of a tax collector. Really, Len, my wife Griselda remarked, buttering her toast with a flourish, if someone were to murder that man, I'd half think they deserved a medal. Her dark eyes sparkled with mischief, but her words, though flippant, carried an edge that made me glance up from my tea. Griselda, 20 years my junior, and blessed with a wit as sharp as her beauty, had a knack for saying what others only dared think. The Colonel, with his booming voice and unyielding opinions, was no favourite in the village. His tenure as churchwarden had been marked by petty disputes over hymnals, pew arrangements, even the quality of the altar candles. He treats us all like errant schoolboys, I muttered, pushing aside my plate. Griselda laughed, a clear, bell-like sound. Oh, Len, you're too good-natured. If I were you, I'd tell him to mind his own business. But I could not so easily dismiss the man, for he was due at the vicarage that evening at 6 o'clock. To discuss his latest complaints, a meeting I dreaded. The morning passed in a blur of parish duties. I visited old Mr. Hawes, who was recovering from a bout of bronchitis, and listened patiently to Mrs. Price Ridley's tirade about the choir boy's behaviour. As I walked back through the village, the air was warm with the scent of late summer. Roses. I paused by the garden gate of Miss Jane Marple, our neighbour, whose cottage sat opposite the vicarage. She was bent over her flower beds, her straw hat bobbing as she clipped at a wayward stem. Miss Marple, with her gentle demeanor and unassuming air, was often underestimated by those who did not know her. But I had learned to respect the keen intelligence that lay behind her mild blue eyes. "Good morning, Vicar," she called, straightening up with a small smile. "Your roses are looking splendid," I replied, though my mind was elsewhere. She tilted her head, studying me in that disconcerting way of hers, as if she could see straight through to one's private thoughts. "Trouble brewing, I shouldn't wonder," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the hum of bees. I laughed, assuming she referred to some trivial village gossip. "Nothing more than the usual, Miss Marple," I said. "Colonel Prothero's on the warpath again." Her eyes flickered, but she only nodded and returned to her pruning. I walked on, dismissing her words as the fancies of an elderly spinster with too much time on her hands. Yet, as I neared the vicarage, her remark lingered. St. Mary Mead was a place of quiet routines, where the most scandalous event was a missed letter or a squabble over the Women's Institute tea roster. But the Colonel's presence was like a stone cast into a still pond, sending ripples of discontent through our little community. At the Blue Boar, I'd overheard mutterings about his harsh treatment of tenants at the old hall, his sprawling estate. Even Lawrence Redding, the young artist who had taken up residence in the village, had clashed with him over a matter of a right-of-way path. And then there was Anne Prothero, the Colonel's young wife, whose strained smiles at church hinted at a life less idyllic than her elegant appearance suggested. Back at the vicarage, I tried to focus on my sermon, but the Colonel's impending visit loomed. Griselda, lounging on the sofa with a novel, sensed my mood. "Don't let him bully you, Len," she said, tossing her book aside. "He's not worth the frown lines." I smiled despite myself, but as I glanced out the window toward Miss Marple's cottage, I felt a prickle of unease. The Colonel's shadow seemed to stretch further than I had realized, and I could not shake the feeling that this day, so ordinary in its beginnings, was poised on the edge of something darker. Chapter 2. The shot in the study. The clock in the vicarage hall was striking 6 as I trudged up the lane from Mrs. Archer's cottage, my mind still tangled in her endless complaints about rheumatism and the rising cost of coal. The old woman had kept me longer than I intended, her querulous voice weaving a web of ailments that made escape impossible. I had promised Colonel Prothero a meeting at the vicarage study at 6 sharp, and now I was late. A fact that would no doubt earn me a lecture from the man himself. The Colonel, with his military precision and unyielding sense of propriety, was not one to tolerate tardiness, even from a vicar. As I hurried through the garden gate, the evening air was soft, scented with honeysuckle, but there was a stillness that felt unnatural, as if St. Mary Mead held its breath. The vicarage, a rambling old house with creaking floors and draughty windows, stood quiet. Griselda was out, likely at the Women's Institute or visiting her friend Lettice Prothero, the Colonel's daughter. Mary, our housekeeper, was nowhere in sight, though I caught the faint clatter of pots from the kitchen. I pushed open the front door, expecting to hear the Colonel's booming voice or the impatient tap of his cane. Instead, silence greeted me, broken only by the tick of the hall clock. I called out, "Colonel Prothero," but received no reply. Frowning, I made my way to the study, a small room at the back of the house where I kept my books and papers. The door was ajar, which was odd. Mary was meticulous about closing it to keep out the dust. I stepped inside and froze. Colonel Lucius Prothero was there, but not as I had expected. He was slumped over my desk, his head resting on the blotting paper, a dark stain spreading beneath him. Blood, stark and glistening, pooled around his temple, and a small pistol lay discarded on the floor near his feet. The air smelled faintly of cordite, sharp and acrid. For a moment I stood rooted, my mind refusing to process the scene. The Colonel, so imposing in life, looked diminished in death, his stern features slack, his eyes staring blankly at nothing. My heart thudded, and I forced myself to move closer. A single wound marred his forehead, precise and deadly. The clock on the mantelpiece read 6:25, its relentless ticking, a mockery of the stillness before me. "Mary," I shouted, my voice hoarse. The housekeeper appeared moments later, her apron askew, her face paling as she took in the scene. "Lord, have mercy," she gasped, clutching the doorframe. "Don't touch anything," I said, though my own hands trembled as I backed away. "Fetch Dr. Haydock and send for the police." Mary nodded, her usual sullenness replaced by wide-eyed panic, and she hurried off. I stood guard over the study, my thoughts a jumble. The Colonel, murdered in my own home. How could such a thing happen in St. Mary Mead? The open window caught my eye, its latch undone, the curtains stirring slightly in the evening breeze. Had the killer entered from the garden? The front door had been locked when I arrived, a habit Mary enforced religiously. The back door, perhaps. But it led through the kitchen, where Mary had been working. Dr. Haydock arrived first, his medical bag in hand, his face grim as he examined the body. "Shot through the head," he said, his voice clipped. "Death was instantaneous. I'd wager happened not long ago, perhaps 20 minutes. He glanced at the clock. Around 6:20, give or take. I nodded, my throat tight. The Colonel had been alive when I left for Mrs. Archer's at 5:30. Whoever had done this had acted swiftly. Haydock straightened, his eyes narrowing, as he took in the room. "That pistol," he said, pointing to the weapon on the floor, "looks like a service revolver. Not the sort of thing you find lying about in a vicarage." Before I could respond, the unmistakable bustle of Inspector Slack announced his arrival. Slack was a man of boundless energy, his sharp features and brisk movements suggesting a terrier on the scent. He strode into the study, his eyes darting from the body to the pistol to the open window. "Well, Vicar," he said, his tone clipped. "This is a fine mess. Care to explain why a man's been shot dead in your study?" I bristled at the implication, but recounted my movements. The visit to Mrs. Archer, my delayed return, the discovery of the body. Slack's pencil scratched furiously in his notebook. "You were expecting him at 6, you say. Anyone else know about this meeting?" "Only Griselda, I believe," I said. "And possibly Mary, though I doubt she paid much attention." Slack grunted, his gaze lingering on the pistol. "We'll have that tested for prints," he said. "And the window looks like our man came in from the garden. Any enemies, this Colonel?" I hesitated. Enemies. The Colonel had no shortage of those. His domineering ways had alienated half the village tenants, tradesmen, even his own family. But I mentioned only the general discontent, unwilling to fuel Slack's penchant for snap judgments. "We'll need a list of everyone who was near the vicarage this evening," he said, already barking orders to a constable who had followed him in. The constable, a young man named Hurst, began cordoning off the room, while Slack prowled about, examining the desk, the chair, the carpet. He paused at a crumpled piece of paper near the Colonel's hand, half hidden by the blotting paper. "What's this?" he muttered, carefully lifting it with a handkerchief. It was a note, scrawled in what looked like the Colonel's hand. 6:20 must settle this. The words were cryptic, the ink smudged as if written in haste. Slack's eyes gleamed. "Looks like he was expecting trouble. Any idea what this means, Vicar?" I shook my head, puzzled. The note was vague, yet it suggested the Colonel had been anticipating something or someone at the very moment of his death. As Slack continued his inspection, I stepped into the hall, needing air. The vicarage felt oppressive, its familiar. Walls now tainted by violence. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, villagers drawn by the sight of the police car. Mrs. Price Ridley, her hat askew, was already holding court, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "Shot," I heard, "in the vicar's own study. It's that artist, mark my words, Lawrence Redding. He and the Colonel had words last week." I winced, knowing how quickly gossip spread in St. Mary Mead. Reading, with his easy charm and quick temper, was an easy target for suspicion. But surely he wouldn't be so reckless. I caught sight of Miss Jane Marple across the lane, standing at her gate, her knitting tucked under one arm. Her eyes, sharp as ever, met mine, and she beckoned me over. Relieved to escape the chaos, I crossed to her. "A dreadful business, Vicar," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Poor Colonel Prothero, though I dare say he was not a man to inspire affection." I nodded, still shaken. "It's unthinkable, Miss Marple. In my study, of all places." She tilted her head, her gaze drifting toward the vicarage. "The study window, I presume. It faces the garden, and the hedge is low there. Anyone could slip in unnoticed." Her tone was casual, but I sensed the wheels turning in her mind. "Did you see anything?" I asked, hoping for a clue. She shook her head, but her expression was thoughtful. "Not today, Vicar, but I did notice young Lettuce Prothero near your gate this afternoon, looking rather distracted, and Mrs. Lestrange she passed by around 5, walking toward the old hall." I frowned. Lettuce, the Colonel's daughter, was a flighty girl, more concerned with tennis and dances than her father's affairs, and Mrs. Lestrange, the enigmatic newcomer who kept to herself, was an unlikely figure in this drama. Yet Miss Marple's observations, however trivial they seemed, had a way of proving significant. Back at the vicarage, Slack was questioning Mary, who was bristling at his tone. "I was in the kitchen, wasn't I?" she snapped. "Didn't hear nothing, didn't see nothing. The back door was locked, same as always." Slack's eyes narrowed. "And the front door?" Mary hesitated. "Locked, to Vicar must have used his key." I confirmed this, but Slack's skepticism was palpable. He turned to me. "Anyone else have a key to this place?" I shook my head. "Only Griselda and myself." He made a note, then gestured to the constable. "Get a statement from everyone in the village who was out this evening, and find out where Mrs. Prothero was. She need to be informed." The mention of Anne Prothero sent a pang through me. The Colonel's wife, a woman of quiet elegance, would now be a widow. I wondered how she would take the news. Her marriage to the Colonel had been the subject of much speculation, her youth and beauty a stark contrast to his gruff demeanor. I offered to accompany Slack to the old hall, but he waved me off. "You stay here, Vicar, we'll handle it." Reluctantly, I remained, watching as the police continued their work. The study, once a haven of quiet reflection, was now a crime scene, its every detail scrutinized. As the evening deepened, Griselda returned, her face paling as I told her what had happened. "In our study," she whispered, clutching my arm. "Oh, Len, how awful." Her usual levity was gone, replaced by a fear I rarely saw in her. I tried to comfort her, but my own thoughts were racing. The open window, the locked doors, the cryptic note, what did it all mean, and why here, in the heart of our home? The village, so peaceful on the surface, seemed to hide secrets I had never suspected. Miss Marple's words echoed in my mind. Trouble brewing. She had sensed something, even before the shot was fired. As I glanced out the window toward her cottage, I saw her silhouette in the lamplight, her knitting needles moving steadily. She was watching, as always, and I wondered what her sharp eyes had already pieced together. The Colonel's death was no random act, I felt sure of that. But who had pulled the trigger, and why? In St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone's business, the answer lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 3. The Village Whispers. The morning after Colonel Prothero's murder dawned bright and deceptively serene, as if St. Mary Mead could shrug off the stain of violence with a fresh layer of sunlight. Yet beneath the village's placid surface, a current of unease ran strong. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this quiet parish, had slept fitfully, haunted by the image of the Colonel slumped over my desk, his blood seeping into the blotting paper. The vicarage, once a sanctuary, felt tainted, its familiar creaks and shadows now tinged with menace. Griselda, usually so buoyant, was subdued over breakfast, her toast untouched as she stared out the window toward the garden where the police had tramped the previous evening. "It's like a nightmare, Len," she said, her voice low. "Murder here in our own home. What will people say?" I reached for her hand, but my own thoughts were restless. What people would say was already becoming clear. As I stepped out to fetch the morning post, I caught fragments of hushed conversations. From passers-by Mrs. Baker, the grocer's wife, murmuring to the postman about that dreadful business at the vicarage, and young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, loitering by the gate with a gleeful air, as if the murder were a penny dreadful come to life. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, had a knack for gossip, and the Colonel's death was fuel for a blaze that would not soon die down. I made my way to the Blue Boar, the village pub, to clear my head and gauge the mood. The taproom was abuzz, its usual hum of banter replaced by fervent speculation. Mrs. Price, Ridley, a formidable widow with a nose for scandal, held court at a corner table, her voice carrying over the clink of glasses. I said to myself, the moment I heard, "It's that Lawrence Redding," she declared, her pince-nez glinting. He and the Colonel had words last week something about a footpath near the old hall. Redding's got a temper. You mark my words. The others nodded, eager to agree. Redding, the young artist who had taken up residence in a converted barn on the village outskirts, was a figure of fascination, his bohemian ways and easy charm a stark contrast to the Colonel's rigid propriety. But a murderer, I found it hard to credit, though the memory of Redding's flushed face during a recent parish meeting, when the Colonel had dismissed his ideas for a village fete, gave me pause. I ordered a coffee, hoping to remain unnoticed. But Mrs. Price, Ridley's sharp eyes found me. "Vicar," she called, beckoning me over. "You must be dreadfully shaken, poor man. To think such wickedness in your own study." I murmured something vague, but she pressed on. "I saw Redding myself, you know, near the vicarage yesterday. Afternoon, skulking, that's the word for it. And then there's Mrs. Protheroe, I mean. She's been looking peaky lately, don't you think? Not that I'm one to gossip, but a wife knows more than she lets on." Her insinuations hung heavy, and I excused myself, feeling the weight of the village's scrutiny. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I resolved to visit Miss Jane Marple. Her cottage, with its neat garden and lace-curtained windows, was a haven of calm amid the storm. Miss Marple, though often dismissed as a harmless spinster, had a mind as sharp as a paring knife, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of St. Mary Mead. I found her in her sitting room, a skein of pale blue wool. In her lap, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Good morning, Vicar," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "I expected you sooner. Murder does stir things up, doesn't it?" Her tone was light, but her gaze was keen, and I felt a flicker of relief at her steadiness. I recounted the events of the previous evening, the Colonel's body, the open window, the cryptic note, Inspector Slack's brusque efficiency. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her needles never faltering. When I mentioned the villagers' chatter about Lawrence Redding, she tilted her head. "Mr. Redding is a convenient scapegoat," she said, "a stranger of sorts, and spirited enough to make enemies. But people forget, Vicar, how easily gossip can be misdirected. It's like a conjurer's trick watch, the left hand, and you miss what the right is doing." Her words were cryptic, but they echoed my own unease. The village was quick to point fingers, but what lay beneath the surface? "And Mrs. Prothero," I ventured, recalling Mrs. Price Ridley's remarks. "People are talking about her, too." Miss Marple's smile faded slightly. "Poor Anne Prothero. A young woman married to a man like the Colonel, it can't have been easy. I've noticed her at church, Vicar. She has a way of holding herself, as if she's bracing for a storm. But suspicion falls easily on a wife, doesn't it? Especially one so lovely." Her tone was gentle, but I sensed a warning. Anne Prothero, with her quiet grace and shadowed eyes, was an enigma. I had seen her only days before, pausing by the churchyard gate, her gloved hands twisting a handkerchief as if wrestling with some private trouble. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and poured tea from a delicate china pot. "The trouble with a village like ours," she said, "is that everyone thinks they know everything. But knowledge is slippery, Vicar. Take the time of the murder, 6:20, Dr. Haydock said, based on the clock and the body, yet time can be muddled, can't it? Clocks run fast or slow, and people's memories are not as reliable as they believe." I stared at her, struck by the implication. The study clock had indeed been erratic lately, a fact I'd mentioned to Mary only last week. It had been tampered with, and the note, 6:20 must settle, this was it, a clue or a deception. "You think someone planned this carefully," I said, my voice low. Miss Marple's eyes met mine. "I think, Vicar, that murder is rarely impulsive. It takes a certain boldness to shoot a man in broad daylight, in a vicar's study no less. And boldness often comes with a plan." She paused, then added, "I couldn't help noticing, yesterday, how busy your garden was. Letty Prothero was there, looking for a brooch," she said. "And Mrs. Lestrange passed by twice, which is unusual for her. She keeps to herself, that one." I frowned, trying to recall the afternoon. Lettuce, with her airy manner, had indeed been poking about the vicarage, but I'd thought nothing of it. And Mrs. Lestrange, the mysterious widow who had arrived in St. Mary Mead only weeks ago, was a figure of curiosity, her aloofness fueling speculation. I thanked Miss Marple and left, her words swirling in my mind. The village was alive with activity children playing by the green, the milk cart rattling down the lane butt. The air felt charged, as if every glance held a question. I decided to call on Anne Prothero, both as a pastoral duty and to satisfy my growing curiosity. The old hall, the Colonel's imposing estate, lay a mile beyond the village, its red brick facade half hidden by ancient oaks. As I approached, I saw Lettuce in the garden, her blonde hair catching the sun as she swung a tennis racket idly. "Hello, Vicar," she called, her voice bright but her eyes shadowed. "Awful about father, isn't it? I can't quite believe it." Her nonchalance was jarring, but I sensed a brittleness beneath it. "Is your stepmother at home?" I asked. Lettuce nodded, pointing toward the house. "In the drawing room, probably. She's been awfully quiet since last night." I thanked her and entered, greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Reeves, whose red-rimmed eyes suggested she'd been crying. Anne Prothero was seated by a window, a book unopened in her lap. She rose as I entered, her face pale but composed. "Vic," she said, her voice steady, "it was kind of you to come." Her dark eyes held mine, and I saw a flicker of something grief, perhaps, or fear. We spoke of the Colonel, of funeral arrangements, but the conversation felt stilted. I mentioned the village's shock, and her lips tightened. People talk, don't they? She said softly. They always do. I hesitated, then asked where she had been the previous evening. I was walking, she said, her gaze drifting to the window. In the woods behind the hall. I needed air. Her answer was vague, unprovable, and I wondered if Miss Marple hint about misdirection applied here. Anne was poised, but her hands clasped tightly, betrayed her calm. As I left the old hall, I passed Lawrence Redding's studio, a converted barn near the village edge. On impulse, I knocked, and he opened the door, his shirt sleeves rolled up, paint smudged on his cheek. "Vicar," he said, his tone wary, "come to pray for my soul." His attempt at humour fell flat, and I saw strain in his eyes. I mentioned the village gossip, hoping to gauge his reaction. "Let them talk," he said, his voice sharp. "The colonel was a brute, but I didn't kill him." He paused, then added, "I was in my studio all evening, working. Ask anyone." His defensiveness was palpable, and I left, unconvinced. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Slack was waiting, his notebook in hand. "We've got statements from half the village," he said, his tone brisk. "Nobody saw much, but everyone's got an opinion. That Redding fellow, he's got a motive, all right. And Mrs. Prothero's alibi is thin as paper." He showed me a list of names, villagers who had been near the vicarage, including Lettice, Mrs. Lestrange, and even old Mr. Hawes, who claimed he'd been napping in his garden. Slack's eyes gleamed. "Someone's lying, Vicar, and I'll find out." Who, as he left, I sat in the drawing room, the weight of the day pressing on me. Griselda joined me, her face still pale. "Len, what if they suspect us?" she whispered. It was our study, after all. I reassured her, but my mind was elsewhere. Miss Marple's words about time and misdirection haunted me. The village. Whispers were growing louder, weaving a web of suspicion around Reading and even Lettice. But the truth, I felt sure, lay deeper, hidden in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, where secrets festered like roots beneath the soil. Chapter 4. The artist's confession. The sun was high over St. Mary Mead by mid-morning, casting a golden glow that seemed to mock the dark undercurrent now rippling through the village. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero in my vicarage study had set tongues wagging, and the air was thick with conjecture, as if every villager had become an amateur sleuth overnight. I, Leonard Clement, felt the weight of it keenly, not just the violation of my home, but the suspicion that seemed to cling to everyone I passed. The vicarage, once a place of quiet reflection, now buzzed with the comings and goings of Inspector Slack's men, their boots tracking mud across my carpets. Griselda, ever resilient, tried to lighten the mood over breakfast, suggesting we host a tea party to cheer the village up. But her jest fell flat, and I saw the strain in her eyes, mirroring my own unease. The morning took a dramatic turn when news reached me that Lawrence Redding, the young artist whose name was on every gossip's lips, had marched into the police station and confessed to the murder. The tidings came via Mary, our housekeeper, who had heard it from the milkman, who had it from the constable's wife. "Says he shot the colonel, sir," Mary said, her usual sullenness replaced by a rare spark of excitement. "Just walked in and told Mr. Slack straight out." I stared at her, incredulous. Reading, with his quick temper and bohemian air, had been a prime suspect in the village's chatter, but a confession. It seemed too sudden, too tidy for a crime so shocking. I made my way to the police station, a squat brick building at the edge of the village, hoping to learn more. Inspector Slack was in his element, his sharp features alight with triumph as he waved a sheaf of papers. "Got him, Vicar," he said, barely glancing up. "Readying came in an hour ago, cool as you like, and said he did it. Shot Prothero in a fit of rage, he claims, over some row about a painting commission. Says he used his own pistol. Plack's tone was smug, but I felt a prickle of doubt. Redding's confession, so neatly aligned with the village's suspicions, seemed almost rehearsed, like a line from one of Griselda's novels. "May I speak with him?" I asked. Slack shrugged, clearly pleased to have the case all but solved. "If you must. He's in the back, but don't expect much." Sense from him, I was led to a small bare room where Redding sat, his hands clasped on a scarred wooden table. He looked younger than his 30 years, his dark hair dishevelled, his eyes shadowed but defiant. "Vicar," he said, managing a faint smile. "Come to absolve me." His attempt at levity was strained, and I saw a flicker of something in his gaze, fear, perhaps, or something more calculated. "Lawrence," I said, keeping my voice steady, "why have you done this?" He leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "It's simple enough. The Colonel and I argued last week. He called my work rubbish, said I was wasting his time with a portrait he'd commissioned. I lost my temper, went to the Vicarage yesterday and shot him, left through the garden window. That's all there is to it." His words were clipped, almost rote, and I felt a chill. The story fit the evidence, the pistol, the open window, the time of death, but it was to Pat, too devoid of the passion I'd expect from a man confessing to murder. "Where were you at 6:15? I asked, recalling Dr. Haydock's estimate. Of the murder's timing, Redding's eyes flickered. "In your study, Vicar. I did it around then slipped out. I was back at my studio by past." His tone was steady, but I sensed a hesitation, as if he were reciting a script he hadn't fully mastered. I pressed further, asking about the note found on the Colonel's body. 6:20 must settle this. Redding shrugged. "No idea. Maybe he was writing about our row." But his casual dismissal rang false, and I left the station with more questions than answers. As I walked back through the village, the weight of Redding's confession settled over me. The Blue Boar was quieter now, the morning crowd dispersed, but I overheard snatches of talk, Mrs. Baker whispering to the postmistress about Redding's wild ways, and old Mr. Hawes muttering that artists can't be trusted. The village had all but convicted Reading, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that his confession was a facade, a shield for something or someone else. I decided to seek Miss Jane Marple's counsel, knowing her knack for seeing through the fog of human motives. Her cottage was as tranquil as ever, the scent of lavender drifting from her garden. She welcomed me with a smile, her knitting set aside as she poured tea from a silver pot. "I heard about Mr. Redding," she said before I could speak, her eyes twinkling with that uncanny perception. "A confession is a dramatic thing, Vic, but drama can hide as much as it reveals." I recounted my visit to the police station, Redding's flat recitation, the odd precision of his story. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Words are cheap," she said at last. "It's actions that tell the truth. A young man like Mr. Redding, so full of fire, he confesses to protect someone, perhaps, or to muddy the waters." Her suggestion startled me. "Protect someone," I echoed. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "Love, Vicar, makes people do foolish things. I couldn't help noticing, yesterday, how Mrs. Prothero was seen leaving Mr. Redding's studio. Quite early in the day, but tongues will wag. My mind raced. Anne Prothero, the Colonel's widow, had been the subject of whispers, her pale face and strained demeanor noted by all. Could Redding be shielding her, or were they both entangled in something deeper? Miss Marple's voice broke my thoughts. Consider the timing, Vicar. Mr. Redding says he was at the Vicarage at 6:15. But Mrs. Lestrange passed by then, and she saw no one. And Lettice Prothero was poking about your garden earlier looking for a brooch. She said, but young girls are not always so innocent. I left Miss Marple's cottage with my thoughts in a whirl. The village, so small and familiar, seemed to pulse with secrets. I decided to call on Anne Prothero, hoping to gauge her reaction to Redding's confession. The old hall was hushed, its heavy curtains drawn against the midday sun. Mrs. Reeves, the housekeeper, showed me to the drawing room where Anne sat. By a cold fireplace, a shawl draped over her shoulders despite the warmth. Her beauty was undimmed, but her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands restless as she greeted me. Vicar, she said, her voice soft but steady, you've heard about Lawrence? I nodded, watching her closely. He says he killed your husband. Do you believe him? Her lips parted, then closed, as if weighing her words. Lawrence is impulsive, she said at last. He and Lucius didn't get on, but murder. I can't imagine it. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held mine, and I sensed a guardedness, a careful choice of words. I mentioned the village gossip, hoping to draw her out, but she only smiled faintly. People will talk, won't they? They always do. She rose, signaling the end of our conversation, and I left, unconvinced by her composure. On my way back, I passed Redding's studio again. The door was ajar, and I glimpsed Lettice Prothero inside, her laughter ringing out as she spoke to someone unseen. Her presence there, so soon after Redding's confession, struck me as odd. Lettice, with her careless charm, seemed an unlikely conspirator, but Miss Marple's hint about young girls lingered. I resolved to speak with her later, but first I returned to the vicarage, where Inspector Slack was waiting, his face a mix of irritation and excitement. Got more on reading, he said, thrusting a notebook at me. His pistol matches the bullet, and we found paint flecks on the study carpet, same kind he uses. Case closed, I'd say. I frowned, unconvinced. What about the note? I asked. Slack shrugged. Prothero wrote it, probably about Redding. Doesn't change the facts. But the facts, I felt, were too convenient. Redding's confession, the pistol, the paint-it, all pointed to him, yet it felt staged, like a play with two perfect props. I mentioned Miss Marple's comment about timing, but Slack scoffed. That old lady and her fancies. Stick to sermons, Vic. As evening fell, I sat in the vicarage garden, the air heavy with the scent of roses. Griselda joined me, her face pale. Len, do you think Redding really did it? She asked. I shook my head, unable to voice my growing suspicion that his confession was a sacrifice, a bold move to protect someone else, perhaps another. The village whispers had painted Redding as the villain, but Miss Marple's words echoed. Watch the actions, not the words. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the truth lay hidden, woven into the quiet routines of its inhabitants, waiting for someone to unravel it. Chapter 5. The widow's tale. The days following Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder had transformed St. Mary Mead from a sleepy village into a cauldron of suspicion, where every glance seemed to carry an unspoken accusation. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this once peaceful parish, found myself navigating a world where the familiar faces of my flock now masked secrets I could only guess at. Lawrence Redding's startling confession had given Inspector Slack a neat solution to the crime, but doubts gnawed at me, fueled by Miss Jane Marple's cryptic observations about misdirection and motive. The vicarage, still bearing the scars of the police's intrusion, felt less like a home and more like a stage where a grim drama was unfolding. Griselda, usually so quick to laugh off troubles, was quieter now, her eyes darting to the study door as if expecting the Colonel's ghost to emerge. By mid-afternoon, the village was abuzz with fresh gossip. Redding's confession had solidified his guilt in the eyes of many, but whispers about Anne Prothero, the Colonel's widow, grew louder. Her pale beauty and reserved demeanor made her a natural target for speculation, and Mrs. Price Ridley. Insinuations at the Blue Boar had taken root. A wife always knows more than she lets on, she'd said, her voice dripping with certainty. I decided to call on Anne, both to offer pastoral support and to probe the truth behind her composed exterior. The old hall, the Prothero estate, stood a mile beyond the village, its red brick walls half hidden by ancient oaks. As I approached, the air was heavy with the scent of late summer, but the house itself seemed shrouded in gloom, its windows reflecting a leaden sky. Lettice Prothero, the Colonel's daughter, was lounging on the lawn, a magazine discarded beside her. She waved languidly, her blonde hair catching the faint sunlight. "Hallo, Vicar," she called, her tone airy but her eyes wary. "Come to console the grieving family." Her flippancy jarred me, given her father's recent death, but Lettice had always been more interested in tennis and dances than familial duties. "Is Mrs. Prothero at home?" I asked. She nodded, pointing toward the house. "In the morning room, probably. She's been frightfully dull since, well, you know." I thanked her and entered, greeted by Mrs. Reeves, the housekeeper, whose pinched face suggested she was still reeling from the tragedy. Anne Prothero was seated by a tall window in the morning room, a tray of untouched tea before her. She rose as I entered, her movements graceful but deliberate, as if each gesture were calculated. "Vicar," she said, her voice soft and melodic, "how kind of you to come." Her dark eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of emotion, grief, perhaps, or something more guarded. She wore a simple black dress, the morning attire accentuating her pallor. Yet there was an elegance about her that seemed untouched by the chaos around her. We sat, and I expressed my condolences, though the words felt inadequate in the face of such a violent loss. "Thank you," she said, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Lucius was not an easy man, but his death is a shock." Her voice trembled slightly, and she reached for a handkerchief, dabbing at her eyes. The gesture was delicate, almost theatrical, and I recalled Miss Marple's hint about people playing parts. "The village must be talking," she added, her tone wry. "They always do." I nodded, choosing my words carefully. "There's been much said about Mr. Redding's confession," I ventured. "People are surprised, naturally." Anne's lips tightened, and she looked away, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window. "Lawrence is impulsive," she said at last. "He and Lucius clashed often, but I can't believe he'd do such a thing." Her words echoed Redding's own defense, yet there was a hesitancy in her tone that piqued my curiosity. I pressed, gently, asking about her own movements on the evening of the murder. "I was walking," she said, her voice steady now, "in the woods behind the hall. I often go there when I need to think." The answer was vague, offering no witnesses, and I wondered if it was deliberately so. "Alone?" I asked, She nodded, her eyes meeting mine briefly before drifting away, quite alone. The silence that followed was heavy, and I sensed she was holding something back, though her composure never wavered. We spoke of funeral arrangements, a practical matter that seemed to ground her. She mentioned a service at the village church, simple but dignified, and I promised to oversee it. As I rose to leave, I noticed a small photograph on the mantelpiece and the Colonel. Taken years ago, her smile radiant, his stern. "A happier time," she said, following my gaze. Lucius could be kind in his way. Her voice softened, but there was no warmth in it, and I wondered at the life she had led with a man so universally disliked. I left the old hall with a sense of unease, Anne's polished grief lingering in my mind like a half-remembered melody. The village was quieter as I walked back, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the green. I decided to visit Miss Jane Marple, whose insight had already proven invaluable. Her cottage was a haven of order, its garden bursting with roses, the air sweet with their fragrance. She was in her sitting room, a tray of scones and jam on the table, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Vicar," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile, "you look troubled. Come, have some tea and tell me what's on your mind." I recounted my visit to Anne, her vague alibi, her guarded responses about reading. Miss Marple listened, her expression thoughtful, her needles never faltering. "Mrs. Prothero is a woman who knows her role," she said at last, setting her knitting aside. "A widow must grieve, mustn't she? But grief can be a mask, Vicar, as much as a feeling. I've seen her kind before, lovely poised, but with a will of iron beneath." Her words struck me, aligning with my own suspicions. "You think she's hiding something?" I asked. Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze drifting to the window. "I think, Vicar, that a woman like Anne Prothero does not walk alone in woods without purpose, and Mr. Redding's confessions so gallant, so convenient, it makes one wonder, doesn't it?" She poured more tea, her movements precise. "Consider the village vicar. Everyone saw something that day, yet no one saw the truth. Mrs. Lestrange, for instance, she was near the vicarage at 5, looking rather purposeful, and young Lettice, poking about your garden, claiming to have lost a brooch. Brooches are easily found, but secrets are harder to uncover." I frowned, trying to piece together her hints. Mrs. Lestrange, the enigmatic newcomer, had been mentioned before, her aloofness. A source of curiosity, and Lettice, with her careless air, seemed an unlikely player in this drama. Yet Miss Marple's observations suggested otherwise. "What about the note?" I asked, recalling the scrap of paper found on the Colonel's body. 620 must settle. "This," Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A curious thing, that note. Written in haste, they say, but haste can be feigned. And the time 6:20 ties so neatly to Dr. Haydock's estimate. Yet your study clock, Vicar, has been unreliable, hasn't it? Mary mentioned it to my maid only last week." I stared at her, struck by the implication. The clock, which I'd cursed for its erratic ticking, could have been tampered with, shifting the perceived time of death. "You think the note was planted?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "I think, Vicar, that murder requires planning, and planning requires props. A note, a clock, a confessional pieces in a puzzle." I left Miss Marple's cottage with my thoughts in turmoil. The village, so small and familiar, seemed to pulse with hidden motives. On impulse, I detoured to the Blue Boar, hoping to catch the latest gossip. The taproom was lively, with Mrs. Price Ridley once again holding court. "I saw Mrs. Prothero myself," she was saying, her voice carrying over the hum of conversation. "Coming out of Redding's studio 2 days ago, looking flushed. It's scandalous, I tell you." The others nodded, eager to fuel the fire. I slipped out unnoticed, the gossip confirming Miss Marple's hint about Anne and Redding's connection. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Slack was waiting, his notebook bristling with fresh notes. "Got more on Mrs. Prothero," he said, his tone brisk. "No one saw her in those woods, and her maid says she was out longer than usual. And Redding's pistol prints are smudged, but it's his, all right." He seemed convinced of Redding's guilt, but I mentioned Anne's vague alibi, hoping to steer his focus. Slack grunted, unimpressed. "She's a widow, Vicar. They always play the part, but we'll dig deeper." As he left, I sat in the drawing room, Griselda beside me, her face pale. "Len, what if Anne and Redding are in it together?" she whispered, voicing my own fears. I shook my head, unable to answer. The widow's tale, her grief, her alibi, her connection to Redding felt like a carefully woven tapestry, beautiful but concealing something darker. Miss Marple's words about masks and motives echoed, and I knew the truth lay somewhere in the shadows of St. Mary Mead, waiting to be brought into the light. Chapter 6. The curious note. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero had cast a pall over St. Mary Mead, transforming its quiet lanes into a stage for suspicion and whispered theories. Each day brought fresh speculation, and I, Leonard Clement, found myself caught in a web of doubt, my vicarage no longer a haven but a focal point of the village's unease. Lawrence Redding's confession had given Inspector Slack a convenient culprit. Yet Miss Jane Marple's subtle hints about misdirection and hidden motives had planted seeds of skepticism in my mind. Anne Prothero's polished grief, lettuces, flippant demeanor, and the enigmatic Mrs. Lestrange all swirled in my thoughts, each a piece in a puzzle that refused to resolve. The village, with its relentless gossip, seemed to obscure as much as it revealed, and I felt a growing urgency to uncover the truth before suspicion tore St. Mary Mead apart. The morning was crisp, the sky a pale blue that belied the tension beneath. I had barely finished breakfast, Griselda, pushing her eggs about her plate with uncharacteristic listlessness, when Inspector Slack arrived, his brisk manner undimmed by the early hour. He held a small evidence bag, inside which lay the crumpled note found on the colonel's body. 620 must settle this, written in what appeared to be Prothero's angular hand. "This," Slack said, tapping the bag, "is the key. Vicar Prothero wrote it just before he was shot, likely about Redding. Ties the time of death to 620, and Redding's confession fits like a glove." His confidence was unshakable, but I found the note's brevity troubling. Why would a man like the colonel, so precise in his dealings, write something so vague? And why at 6:20, the very moment Dr. Haydock estimated the murder? I studied the note through the bag's clear plastic, noting the smudged ink and uneven scrawl. "It looks hurried," I said, more to myself than to Slack. He nodded, mistaking my doubt for agreement. Exactly. He was expecting trouble, wrote it in a rush, then bang Redding shoots him. But the note's ambiguity nagged at me, and I recalled Miss Marple's comment about props in a carefully planned murder. Could this be one of them? Slack, impatient with my hesitation, moved on to discuss the pistol, which had been confirmed as Redding's, though the fingerprints were too smudged to be conclusive. "We're building the case," he said, striding toward the door. Reddings not wriggling out of this. Left alone, I sat in the drawing room, the notes, words echoing in my mind. Griselda joined me, her usual spark dimmed. "Len, that noted so odd," she said, curling up on the sofa. "Why write something like that? It's not like the Colonel to be so cryptic." Her observation mirrored my own, and I decided to seek Miss Marple's counsel once more. Her cottage, with its orderly garden and air of timeless calm, offered a respite from the village's fevered speculation. I found her tending her chrysanthemums, a pair of pruning shears in hand, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the morning. "Son, good morning, Vicar," she said, her voice warm but her gaze sharp. "You've come about that note, I expect." I started, unsurprised by her perceptiveness, but still caught off guard. I described Slack's confidence in Redding's guilt and the note's role in his theory. Miss Marple set her shears down and dusted her hands. "A note is a curious thing," she said, leading me to her sitting room. "It tells a story, but who's the Colonel's or someone else's?" She poured tea, her movements precise, and sat across from me, her eyes bright with interest. "Tell me, Vicar, what did it look like? The writing, the paper?" I described the note's crumpled state, the smudged ink, the uneven scrawl. She nodded thoughtfully. "Smudged, you say, as if written under duress or made to look that way. And the time 6:20, how convenient that it matches Dr. Haydock's estimate. But your study clock, Vicar, has been unreliable, hasn't it?" My maid mentioned Mary complaining about it. I confirmed this, recalling how the clock had been running fast for days. A fact I'd meant to address but hadn't. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Time is a slippery thing. A clock can be set, a note can be planted, and a confession can be staged. Murder, Vicar, is often a performance." Her words sent a chill through me. "You think the note was fabricated?" I asked. She tilted her head, her knitting needles appearing as if by magic. "I think it's possible. Consider who had access to your study. You were at Mrs. Archer's, Griselda was out, Mary was in. The kitchen, but the garden window was open, and your hedge is low. Lettice Prothero was there that afternoon, wasn't she? Looking for a brooch, she said. And Mrs. Lestrange passed by twice, which is unlike her." I frowned, trying to piece together the implications. Lettice's presence had seemed innocent enough, and Mrs. Lestrange's movements were puzzling but hardly incriminating. Yet Miss Marple's hints suggested a deeper pattern, one I couldn't yet grasp. I left her cottage with a renewed sense of purpose. The note, with its cryptic message and precise timing, felt like a deliberate clue, a deliberate deception. I decided to revisit the vicarage study, hoping to see it with fresh eyes. The room was as the police had left it, the desk still bearing the faint stain of the Colonel's blood, the window latched but not locked. I examined the clock, its hands now stopped at 6:25, a detail I hadn't noticed before. Had it been tampered with before the murder or after? The blotting paper, still on the desk, showed no trace of the note's ink, which struck me as odd. If the Colonel had written it there, wouldn't there be some residue? As I pondered this, Mary appeared, her apron dusted with flour. "Inspector's been asking about the clock," she said, her tone sullen, "wanted to know if anyone touched it. I told him it's been off for days, but I didn't touch nothing." Her defensiveness was typical, but her words confirmed Miss Marple's point. The clock's unreliability could have been exploited, fixing the time of death to suit the killer's narrative. I asked Mary about visitors to the vicarage that day. "Just Miss Lettice, poking about the garden," she said. Said she lost a brooch. Didn't see no one else, except that Mrs. Lestrange walking by. The mention of lettuce again piqued my interest. I decided to call on her at the old hall, hoping to clarify her movements. The estate was quiet, its grandeur muted by the weight of recent events. Ladise was in the conservatory, arranging flowers with a carelessness that bordered on defiance. "Hello, Vicar," she said, snipping a rose stem with unnecessary force. "Come to ask about Father's funeral." Her tone was light, but her eyes were guarded, and I sensed she was bracing for questions. "Lettuce," I said gently, "you were at the vicarage yesterday afternoon, weren't you, looking for a brooch?" She nodded, tossing her hair. "Yes. A silly little thing. Must have dropped it in your garden. Didn't find it, though." Her story was plausible, but her nonchalance felt forced. I pressed further, asking if she'd seen anyone near the study. "Not a soul," she said, too quickly. "I was in and out. You know how it is." But her fingers fidgeted with the rose, and I wondered if her flippancy hid something more. As I left the old hall, I passed Anne Prothero in the hall, her face pale but composed. "Vicar," she said, pausing, "have you heard anything new?" I mentioned Redding's confession, watching her closely. Her lips parted, but she only said, "Poor Lawrence. He's made a terrible mistake." Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted the edge of her shawl, and I recalled Miss Marple's comment about grief as a mask. Was Anne's composure a performance, as Redding's confession might be? Back in the village, I stopped by the Blue Boar, where the gossip had taken a new turn. Mrs. Price Ridley was there, her voice carrying over the taproom's hum. "That note proves it," she was saying. "The Colonel knew reading was coming, and look what happened." The others nodded, eager to accept the simplest explanation. I slipped out, frustrated by their certainty. The note, the clock, Redding's confessional pointed to a neat solution, yet I felt they were pieces of a larger, more intricate design. That evening, I returned to Miss Marple's cottage, unable to shake my unease. She was in her garden, the dusk softening the lines of her face. "Vicar," she said, "you've been busy, haven't you?" I shared my findings, the clock's stopped hands, Lettuce's vague story, Anne's guarded demeanor. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "The note is a clever touch," she said. "It fixes the time, doesn't it? But suppose the time is wrong. Suppose the murder happened earlier, and the note was placed to mislead. Two people working together could arrange such a thing." Her suggestion of a conspiracy sent my thoughts racing. Reading an Anne, perhaps, or even Lettuce, with her convenient brooch. As I walked home, the village was settling into twilight, its lights winking like stars. Griselda met me at the door, her face anxious. "Len, what if the note's a fake?" she said, echoing my own fears. "What if someone's playing a game with us all?" I had no answer, but Miss Marple's words about performance lingered. The note, with its smudged ink and cryptic message, was no mere afterthought. It was a deliberate act, part of a plan that was unraveling the quiet fabric of St. Mary Mead, one carefully placed clue at a time. Chapter 7. The alibi unravels the murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero had woven a net of suspicion over St. Mary Mead, ensnaring its inhabitants in a tangle of whispers and half-truths. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this once tranquil parish, found myself haunted by the image of the Colonel's lifeless form in my study. The cryptic note 620 must settled this, and Lawrence Redding's startling confession, which seemed to me more theatrical than truthful. Miss Jane Marple's hints about misdirection planted clues, and the unreliability of time had stirred my doubts, and the village's relentless gossip only deepened my unease. Each conversation, each sidelong glance, seemed to conceal a fragment of the truth, and I felt driven to piece it together before the fabric of our community unraveled further. The morning was overcast, the sky a dull grey that mirrored the mood of the vicarage. Griselda, usually so quick to dispel gloom with her wit, was subdued, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup as she spoke of the village's fervour. "Everyone's so certain it's readying, Len," she said, her voice low. "But it feels too easy, doesn't it? Like a story someone's written for us to believe." Her words echoed my own thoughts, and I resolved to probe deeper into the alibis that had shaped Inspector Slack's case, particularly those of Lady S. Prothero and Anne, the Colonel's widow whose guarded demeanor had left me wary. I decided to start with Lettice, whose presence in the vicarage garden on the day of the murder had been dismissed as trivial but nagged at me, thanks to Miss Marple's pointed observations. The old hall, the Prothero estate, stood sombre under the heavy sky, its windows reflecting the clouds like unblinking eyes. I found Lettice in the drawing-room, sprawled on a chaise with a fashion magazine, her blonde hair spilling over a cushion. "Hello, Vicar," she said, barely looking up. "Come to plan Father's funeral. Anne's handling all that, you know." Her tone was airy, almost indifferent, but I caught a flicker of unease in her eyes as I sat across from her. "Lettice," I began, choosing my words with care. "You were at the vicarage yesterday afternoon, weren't you, looking for a brooch?" She nodded, flipping a page with exaggerated nonchalance. "Yes, a silly little thing, silver with a pearl. Must-off dropped it near your roses." Her story was the same as before, but its breeziness felt rehearsed, and I pressed further. "What time were you there?" She shrugged, her fingers pausing on the magazine. "Oh, around 6, I suppose. I didn't stay long, didn't want to bother you." Her vagueness was maddening, and I recalled Miss Marple's hint about young girls and their secrets. "Did you see anyone near the study?" I asked. Her eyes flicked up, then away. "No one, just Mary in the kitchen, banging pots about." Before I could press further, the door opened, and Mrs. Reeves, the housekeeper, announced a visitor, Mrs. Lestrange, the mysterious newcomer whose aloofness had sparked much curiosity. She entered, her dark eyes scanning the room, her presence as striking as ever in a tailored coat that spoke of wealth and restraint. "Vicar," she said, nodding to me, then to Lettice, "I came to offer my condolences." Her voice was cool, but there was a purpose in her manner that intrigued me. Lettice muttered a thanks and excused herself, her departure abrupt. I seized the opportunity to question Mrs. Lestrange, recalling Miss Marple's note of her passing the vicarage twice. "On the day of the murder." "Mrs. Lestrange," I said, "I understand you were near the vicarage yesterday evening, around 5. Her gaze sharpened, but she nodded. "Yes, I was walking. I often do, to clear my thoughts." Her answer was as vague as Anne's, and I ventured further. "Did you see anyone, Lettice, perhaps, or Mr. Redding?" She hesitated, then said, "I saw Lettice near the vicarage gate, closer to 6:30, I'd say. She seemed in a hurry. No one else." Her words contradicted Lettice's claim of being there at 6 and leaving promptly, and I felt a spark of excitement. An alibi was beginning to crack, though whose I couldn't yet say. I thanked Mrs. Lestrange and left, her cool demeanor lingering. In my mind, her presence in St. Mary Mead was an enigma. Why had she come, And why was she watching the vicarage? I decided to confront Lettuce with this new information, but first I sought Miss Marple's perspective. Her cottage was a beacon of calm, its garden vibrant despite the grey sky. She was in her sitting room, a tray of scones and tea ready, as if she'd anticipated my visit. "Vicar," she said, her eyes twinkling, "you've been stirring the pot, haven't you? What have you found?" I recounted Letitia's vague story, Mrs. Lestrange's contradiction, and my growing suspicion that the alibis were not what they seemed. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Young people are careless," she said at last, "but they're not always as innocent as they seem. Letitia's brooch is a convenient excuse, isn't it? And Mrs. Lestrange, such a watchful woman. I wonder what she's looking for." She paused, pouring tea with a steady hand. "You mentioned the note, Vicar, and the clock. Have you considered that they might be linked? A clock set wrong, a note placed just so's all part of the performance." Her words echoed her earlier hints, but now they carried a sharper edge. "Performance?" I asked. She nodded. "Murder is rarely a solitary act. It takes two, sometimes, to make a lie convincing." Her suggestion of a conspiracy sent my thoughts racing. Redding's confession, Lettuce's presence, Anne's vague alibi, could they be connected, each a thread in a carefully woven deception? I thanked Miss Marple and returned to the old hall, determined to confront Lettice. I found her in the garden, tossing a tennis ball against the wall with restless energy. "Lettuce," I said, my tone firm, "Mrs. Lestrange saw you near the vicarage at 6:30, not 6. Why did you lie about the time?" Her eyes widened, and she dropped the ball, her composure faltering. I must have got it wrong," she stammered. "I was there longer than I thought, that's all. It's not important, is it?" Her blush and hurried words betrayed her, and I pressed harder. "It's very important, Lettuce. A man was murdered, and you were near the scene." She bit her lip, her eyes darting away. "I didn't see anything, Vicar, I swear. I was just looking for my brooch, and then I left." But her story was crumbling, and I sensed she was hiding something, perhaps out of fear or loyalty to another. I let her go, knowing further pressure might close her off entirely. But her lie had shifted the puzzle's pieces. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Slack was waiting, his notebook bristling with fresh scribbles. "Got something on Miss Prothero," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Her story doesn't add up. Says she was at the vicarage at 6, but Mrs. Lestrange places her there later, and a neighbour saw her heading back to the old hall after 6:30. She's hiding something, Vic." I nodded, sharing his suspicion but wary of his haste. "And readying?" I asked. Slack grunted. "His confession still holds, but this Lettuce business muddies things. If she was there later, it overlaps with his timeline. Could be there. In cahoots." The idea of Lettuce and Redding conspiring seemed far-fetched, yet Miss Marple's hint about two people working together lingered. I mentioned Mrs. Lestrange's sighting, and Slack made a note, his impatience clear. "That woman's a mystery herself," he muttered. "Keeps popping up, but won't say why she's here. I'll have her questioned again." As he left, I sat in the drawing room, Griselda joining me, her face pale. "Len, what if Lettuce saw something?" she said, "or did something? She's so flighty, but there's something off about her." I agreed, my mind turning to the note and the clock. Lettuce's lie about her timing suggested she knew more than she admitted, but was she protecting herself or someone else? The village was alive with gossip. The Blue Boar, abuzz with theories about Lettuce's sneaking about and Redding's guilty conscience. I slipped out to clear my head, passing Redding's studio, where a light burned late. On impulse, I knocked, and he answered, his face drawn. "Vicar," he said, his voice weary, still trying to save my soul. I asked about Lettuce, hoping to catch him off guard. "She's a kid," he said, shrugging, "always flitting about. Don't drag her into this." His defensiveness was telling, and I left, convinced he was hiding something too. As evening fell, I returned to Miss Marple's cottage, the village now cloaked in dusk. She was in her garden, her silhouette soft against the fading light. "Vicar," she said, "you've found a crack in the story, haven't you?" I shared Lettice's lie and Mrs. Lestrange's contradiction, and she nodded. "Alibis are like knitting. Vicar one dropped stitch, and the whole thing unravels. Lettice is young, but youth can be cunning, especially when love is involved. And Mr. Redding's confession, it's too noble, don't you think? Like a knight taking the fall." Her words crystallized my suspicions. Redding and Lettuce, or perhaps Redding and Anne, were shielding each other. Their alibis a fragile shield against the truth. Back at the vicarage, Griselda was waiting, her eyes wide. "Len, what if it's all a trick?" she said. "The note, the clock, Redding's confession. What if someone's playing us all for fools?" I had no answer, but Miss Marple's talk of performance and conspiracy haunted me. The alibi was unraveling, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, where every lie was a step closer to betrayal. Chapter 8. The Clock's Deception. The shadow of Colonel Lucius Prothero's murder hung heavy over St. Mary Mead, its quiet lanes now threaded with suspicion and secrets. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this one-sidelic parish, found myself in a labyrinth of doubt, where each clue seemed to lead only to deeper questions. Lawrence Redding's confession, Lettice Prothero's faltering alibi, and Anne Prothero's guarded composure had woven a tapestry of deception. And Miss Jane Marple's subtle insights about misdirection planted clues, and the fragility of alibis had sharpened my resolve to uncover the truth. The vicarage, still marked by the police's intrusion, felt like a stage where a sinister play was unfolding, and I sensed the key to the mystery lay in the smallest details, overlooked by all but the keenest eyes. The morning was damp, a fine mist cloaking the village as if to mirror the haze of uncertainty that enveloped us. Griselda, pale and restless over breakfast, spoke of the village's growing unease. "It's as if everyone's watching everyone else, Len," she said, her fingers crumbling a scone. "Redding's confession, Lettuce's fibsits, all so tangled. What if we're missing something obvious?" Her words echoed my own fears, and I recalled Miss Marple's hint about time being a tool of deception. The note found on the colonel's body, 6:20 must settle, this and the study clock, which had ticked unreliably for days, seemed central to the puzzle. I decided to investigate further, starting with a revelation from Mary, our housekeeper, that shifted the case's foundation. As I cleared the breakfast dishes, Mary appeared, her apron dusted with flour, her face set in its usual scowl. "That clock in the study, sir," she said, unprompted. "Been running fast for a week. It has." I told the inspector, but he didn't care much. "Thought you should know." I stared at her, the significance of her words dawning. The clock, which Dr. Haydock had used to estimate the time of death at 6:20, was unreliable at fact I'd noted but hadn't fully grasped until now. If it was running fast, the murder could have occurred earlier. Appending the alibis of Redding, Lettice, and Anne, I thanked Mary, who muttered something about police traipsing everywhere, and returned to the kitchen. I hurried to the study, its air still heavy with the memory of the Colonel's death. The clock, a heavy oak affair on the mantel, stood silent now, its hands frozen at 6:25. I examined it closely, noting its dust-covered gears and stiff winding key. It had been running 10 minutes fast, Mary said, which meant the murder likely occurred closer to 6:10. This small discrepancy was seismic, casting doubt on Redding's claim of being in the study at 6:15, Lettice's presence at 6:30, and Anne's vague walk in the woods. I recalled Miss Marple's words about time being manipulated, and a chill ran through me. Had the clock been deliberately set to mislead? I decided to consult Inspector Slack, hoping to share this discovery. I found him at the police station, surrounded by papers, his face a mask of frustration. "Vicar," he said, barely looking up, "unless you've got a new suspect, I'm busy. Redding's case is solid, despite that Prothero girl's nonsense." I mentioned the clock's discrepancy, expecting interest, but he waved it off. 10 minutes, doesn't change much. Reading was there, pistols his, note points to him. Stop chasing shadows. His dismissal rankled, but I pressed on, suggesting the clock could have been tampered with. Slack's eyes narrowed. "You saying someone fiddled with it? Prove it, Vic." I had no proof, only suspicion, and I left, determined to find evidence. My next stop was Miss Jane Marple's cottage, a haven of clarity amid the village's chaos. She was in her garden, clipping faded roses, her straw hat bobbing gently. "Victor," she said, her eyes twinkling, "you've found something, haven't you? Come inside and tell me." Over tea, I shared Mary's revelation about the clock and its implications. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles appearing as if summoned. "A clock is a simple thing to tamper with," she said, her voice soft but incisive. "A few minutes here or there, and an alibi crumbles or holds. If the murder was at 6:10, Mr. Redding's confession is less certain, isn't it? He claims he was at his studio by 6:15, and a neighbour saw him there soon after." I nodded, recalling Redding's timeline, and Anne's walk in the woods. She said she was out all evening, but no one saw her. Could she have been at the vicarage earlier? Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Mrs. Prothero is a woman of careful habits. A walk is a convenient excuse, especially when it leaves no trace, and young Letesca's story shifts like sand." She was at the vicarage later than she admits. According to Mrs. Lestrange, her mention of Lettice and Anne reignited my suspicions. The clock's deception suggested a coordinated effort, a plan requiring precision and complicity. "And the note?" I asked, thinking of its cryptic message. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A clever prop, Vicar. If the clock was set fast, the note's time 6:20 was meant to fix the murder later, when certain people had witnesses. Two people, working together, could stage such a scene, one to act, one to arrange the details." Her hint of a conspiracy was bold, and I felt a surge of clarity. Redding's confession, the note, the clockage was a piece of a performance, designed to obscure the true moment of the Colonel's death. I left Miss Marple's cottage with renewed purpose, determined to test the alibis against the new timeline. I started with reading, visiting his studio on the village outskirts. The barn was cluttered with canvases, the air sharp with turpentine. Redding answered my knock, his face haggard, his paint-stained hands trembling slightly. "Vicar," he said, his tone wary, come to preach repentance. I ignored his jest, asking about his movements at 6:10. I was here, he said, gesturing to a half-finished portrait. Working. Mrs. Baker, next door, saw me at 6:15, like I told Slack. His story held, but his eyes avoided mine, and I sensed he was guarding a secret. Next, I sought Anne Prothero at the old hall. The estate was hushed, its grandeur dimmed by morning. Anne was in the library, a book unopened in her lap, her face pale but composed. "Vicar," she said, rising, "you've been kind to visit." So often, I mentioned the clock's discrepancy, watching her closely. "If the murder was at 6:10, I said, "where were you then?" Her eyes flickered, but she answered smoothly, "Still walking, I suppose. The woods are vast, and I lose track of time." Her vagueness was deliberate, and I pressed further, asking if she'd seen Redding that evening. "No," she said, too quickly. I was alone. Her composure was a shield, and I left, convinced she was hiding something. Lettuce was my next target, but she was out, according to Mrs. Reeves, instead. I encountered Mrs. Lestrange near the village green, her dark coat stark against the mist. On impulse, I asked if she'd seen anyone near the vicarage at 6:10. I was passing around 5. She said, her voice cool, but later I saw Lettuce at 6:30, as I told you. No one else. Her precision contrasted with Anne's ambiguity, and I wondered again at her role in this drama. Why was she so watchful, and what did she seek in St. Mary Mead? Back at the vicarage, I found Inspector Slack, his mood sour. "Your clock theory's causing trouble, Vicar," he said, brandishing his notebook. "Redding's neighbour confirms." He was at his studio by 6:15, which fits if the murder was earlier, but Mrs. Prothero's alibi is still flimsy, and Lettuce, well, she's a liar, but I can't pin her yet. I shared Mrs. Lestrange's latest statement, and Slack made a note, his frustration clear. "This case was simple till you started." "Poking about," he muttered, but I sensed he was beginning to doubt Redding's guilt. That evening, I visited Miss Marple again, the village now cloaked in fog. She was in her sitting room, a fire crackling softly. "Vicar," she said, "you've stirred the waters, haven't you?" I recounted my findings, Redding's corroborated alibi, Anne's evasiveness, Lettuce's absence. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting steady. "The clock's deception is the heart of it," she said. "Someone set it fast to shift the time of death, giving themselves or another shield. Redding's confession protects someone, I think, and Mrs. Prothero's too poised, too careful. Love, Vicar, can make even the cautious bold." Her words crystallized my suspicions. Reading and Anne, perhaps, had orchestrated the murder, using the clock and note to confuse the timeline. Lettuce's lie suggested she knew something, but her role was unclear. As I walked home, the fog thickened, mirroring the mystery's opacity. Griselda met me at the door, her face anxious. "Len, what if the clock was a trick all along?" she said, her voice trembling. "What if we're all being played?" I had no answer, but Miss Marple's talk of performance and complicity haunted me. The clock's deception had cracked the case wide open, but the truth remained just out of reach, lurking in the mist-shrouded corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 9. The village spithe, the murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero, had turned St. Mary Mead into a crucible of suspicion, where every neighbour's glance seemed to conceal a secret. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this once serene parish, felt the weight of the mystery pressing on me, each clue a thread in a tapestry of deception. The discovery that the study clock had been running fast, shifting the time of death to around 6:10, had appended Inspector Slack's tidy case against Lawrence Redding, whose confession now seemed more like a shield than a truth. Miss Jane Marple. Insights about the note's deliberate vagueness, the clock's manipulation, and the possibility of a conspiracy had sharpened my focus, yet the puzzle remained incomplete. Anne Prothero's elusive alibi, Letitia's evasive fibs, and the enigmatic presence of Mrs. Lestrange all pointed to a deeper truth. Hidden in the village's quiet routines, the morning was brisk, a sharp wind rattling the vicarage windows, as if urging me to action. Griselda, still shaken by the case's twists, was quieter than usual, her eyes lingering on the study door. "Len, it's as if the whole village is lying," she said over breakfast, her voice low. "Redding Anne, let Estevan, that Mrs. Lestrange, who can we trust?" Her question mirrored my own unease, and I resolved to pursue Mrs. Lestrange, whose watchful presence near the vicarage on the day of the murder had piqued my curiosity. Miss Marple had noted her passing twice, an unusual pattern for a woman who kept to herself, and her sighting of Lettice at 6:30 had cracked the girl's alibi. Was Mrs. Lestrange merely a bystander, or something more? I set out for her cottage, a modest but elegant house on the village's edge, its garden meticulously tended. The door was answered by a maid, who showed me to a small parlour where Mrs. Lestrange sat, a letter in hand. She rose, her dark eyes assessing me with a cool intensity. "Vicar," she said, her voice smooth but guarded, "to what do I owe this visit?" Her presence was striking tall, poised, with an air of quiet authority that set her apart from the village's usual inhabitants. I offered condolences for the Colonel's death, then steered the conversation to her movements. "On the evening of the murder, I understand you were near the vicarage around 5, I said, watching her closely. "And again later, when you saw Lettice Prothero." Her expression remained composed, but her fingers tightened slightly on the letter. "Yes," she said. "I was walking, as I often do. I saw Miss Prothero near your gate at 6:30, looking rather hurried. I mentioned it to Inspector Slack." Her precision contrasted with the vagueness of others, and I pressed further. "Did you see anyone else, Mr. Redding, perhaps, or Mrs. Prothero?" She shook her head, her gaze steady. "No one else. The village was quiet." Her answer was too neat, and I recalled Miss Marple's hint about misdirection. "You passed the vicarage twice that day," I said. "An unusual route, perhaps." For the first time, her composure flickered, a shadow crossing her face. "I had my reasons," she said, her voice cooler now. "Personal matters, Vicar, that have no bearing on your inquiry." Her refusal to elaborate was telling, and I shifted tactics, asking if she'd known the Colonel. "Only by reputation," she said, her tone clipped. "He was not a man to inspire warmth." The edge in her words suggested more than casual dislike, and I wondered if her presence in St. Mary Mead was tied to Prothero in ways she wouldn't admit. As I left, her parting words lingered. "Be careful, Vicar. Not everyone in this village is what they seem." The warning, veiled but pointed, sent a chill through me. Was she protecting herself, or hinting at another's duplicity? I decided to consult Miss Jane Marple, whose knack for unraveling human motives was unmatched. Her cottage was a haven of calm, its roses defiant against the wind. She welcomed me with a smile, her knitting needles already in motion. "Vicar," she said, "you've been chasing shadows, haven't you? What did Mrs. Lestrange tell you?" I recounted our conversation, her precise citing of Lettice, her vague reasons for passing the vicarage, her cryptic warning. Miss Marple listened, her eyes bright with interest. "Mrs. Lestrange is a fascinating creature," she said, pouring tea from a delicate pot. "So composed, so watchful. I've seen her kind before women with secrets they guard like jewels. Her presence here is no accident, Vicar. She's watching someone, or something." I frowned, puzzled. Watching the Colonel. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps, or perhaps someone closer to him, but she's a distraction, I think. From the heart of the matter." Her words shifted my focus back to Anne and Redian. "You think Mrs. Lestrange is a red herring?" I asked. She nodded, her needles clicking softly. "The real truth lies with those who had motive and opportunity. Mr. Redding's confession is too noble, too convenient. And Mrs. Prothero, her walk in the woods, is a story, not a fact. The clock, set fast, and the note, so carefully timed, they point to a plan. Vicar, one that required 2 pairs of hands. Her suggestion of a conspiracy between Redding and Anne was compelling, but Mrs. Lestrange's role nagged at me. Was she merely an observer or a player in this deadly game? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her gaze drifting to the window. "I couldn't help noticing, Vicar, how Mrs. Lestrange has been seen near the old hall more than once. My maid's cousin, who works there, says she called on Mrs. Prothero last week, though no one knows why. And Letta's such a careless girl, but careless girls see things they shouldn't." Her hints were tantalizing, and I resolved to investigate further. Starting with Anne's connection to Mrs. Lestrange, I headed to the old hall, the wind now whipping through the oaks that lined its drive. Anne was in the drawing room, arranging flowers with a precision that seemed to steady her. "Vicar," she said, her smile faint but warm, "you're a frequent visitor these days." I mentioned Mrs. Lestrange's call, watching her reaction. Her hands paused, a rose stem trembling slightly. "She came to offer condolences," she said, her voice even, a neighbourly gesture, nothing more. But her eyes avoided mine, and I sensed a lie. I asked about her walk on the evening of the murder, hoping to catch her off guard. "As I said, I was in the woods," she replied, her tone firmer now. "Alone, thinking." Her insistence on solitude was unconvincing, and I mentioned the clock's discrepancy, suggesting the murder was earlier. "Does that change anything for you, Mrs. Prothero?" I asked. Her lips parted, but she recovered quickly. "It changes nothing. I wasn't at the Vic." Her defensiveness was palpable, and I left, convinced she was shielding someone Redding, perhaps, or even herself. On my way back, I passed Redding's studio, where a light burned despite the hour. I knocked, and he answered, his face drawn, paint smudged on his cheek. "Vicar," he said, his tone weary, still playing detective. I asked about Mrs. Lestrange, hoping to stir a reaction. "Never met her," he said, shrugging. "Heard she's odd, keeps to herself." His dismissal was too casual, and I pressed further, mentioning her sighting of Lettice. "Lettice is always flitting about," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Don't drag her into this." His protectiveness was telling, and I wondered if he knew more about Lettice's movements than he let on. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Slack was waiting, his notebook bristling with notes. "Got something on Mrs. Lestrange?" he said, his eyes gleaming. "She's been asking questions about the Protheros discreetly, but my men noticed, and she saw Mrs. Prothero near the vicarage that evening, not in the woods, around 6:10. She says now." The revelation was stunning, contradicting Anne's alibi and aligning with the revised time of death. "Why didn't she mention this before?" I asked. Slack grunted. "Says she wasn't sure of the time till we pressed her. Sounds fishy, but it puts Mrs. Prothero in the frame. I shared Miss Marple's theory about a conspiracy, and Slack scoffed. Your spinster friends got too much imagination, but I'll question Mrs. Prothero again, and the strange she's hiding something, mark my words. As he left, I sat in the drawing room, Griselda joining me, her face pale. Len, if Mrs. Lestrange saw Anne, why stay quiet till now? She asked. Is she protecting her, or setting her up? I had no answer, but the village spy's sudden revelation shifted the case's balance. That evening, I returned to Miss Marple's cottage, the village now cloaked in twilight. She was in her sitting room, a fire casting soft shadows. Vicar, she said, Mrs. Lestrange has stirred things up, hasn't she? I shared Slack's news about Anne's sighting, and Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Lestrange is playing a game, Vicar. Her silence, then her sudden candour, it's deliberate. But the truth lies with Anne and Redding. Their alibis are crumbling, and the clock's deception points to them. Love, Vicar, can blind, but it also binds. They're protecting each other, I think. Her words crystallized my suspicions. Mrs. Lestrange, the village spy, had thrown a spotlight on an O, but her own motives remained opaque. Was she a witness or a manipulator? As I walked home, the stars piercing the night sky, I felt the truth, drawing closer, hidden in the interplay of lies that defines St. Mary Mead's darkest hour. Chapter 10. The lovers' plot. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero had plunged St. Mary Mead into a mire of suspicion, where every word and gesture seemed laden with hidden meaning. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this once peaceful parish, felt as if I were navigating a fog, each clue a fleeting shape that promised clarity but delivered only more questions. The revelation that the study clock had been running fast, placing the murder closer to 6:10, had unravelled the alibis of Lawrence Redding, Anne Prothero, and Lettice Prothero, while Mrs. Lestrange's belated claim of seeing Anne near the vicarage at that time had cast a new shadow over the Colonel's widow. Miss Jane Marple's insights about the note's deliberate placement, the clock's manipulation, and the possibility of a conspiracy driven by love had guided my inquiries. Yet the truth remained elusive, a whisper in the village's restless air. The morning was raw, a chill wind sweeping through St. Mary Mead, as if to scour away its secrets. Griselda, pale and pensive over breakfast, spoke of the villagers' growing unease. Len, it's as if we're all suspects now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Anne, readying, even Lettice, everyone's hiding something. And Mrs. Lestrange, watching like a hawk waits her game. Her questions echoed my own, and I felt a mounting urgency to confront the contradictions that defined the case. Redding's confession, so gallant yet so convenient, seemed less a truth than a shield, and Anne's composure, pierced by Mrs. Lestrange's accusation, hinted at a deeper involvement. I resolved to challenge Anne directly, hoping to break through her polished facade. I set out for the old hall, the Prothero estate looming under a sky heavy with clouds. The grounds were silent, the oaks standing like sentinels as I approached the house. Mrs. Reeves, the housekeeper, greeted me with a weary nod, her eyes red-rimmed from grief or exhaustion. Mrs. Prothero's in the morning room, she said, leading me through the hushed corridors. Anne was seated by a window, a embroidery hoop in her lap, though her needle lay idle. She rose as I entered, her face pale but composed, her dark eyes meeting mine with a guarded intensity. Vicar, she said, her voice soft but steady, you've been a comfort in these dreadful days. What brings you today? I wasted no time, my resolve, steeled by Miss Marple's warnings about deception. "Mrs. Prothero," I said, "Mrs. Lestrange has told Inspector Slack she saw you near the vicarage at 6:10 on the evening of the murder, not in the woods, as you claimed. Why did you lie about your whereabouts?" Her composure faltered, her hands tightening on the embroidery hoop, but she recovered quickly. "Mrs. Lestrange must be mistaken," she said, her tone cool. "I was walking, as I told you. The woods are near the vicarage. She may have confused the paths." Her explanation was plausible but thin, and I pressed further, mentioning the clock's discrepancy and the revised time of death, whether at 6:10 or 6:20. I said, "Your alibi is unconfirmed, and Mr. Redding's confession, does it not strike you as too convenient, too protective?" Her eyes widened, a flash of fear breaking through her calm. "Lawrence is impulsive," she said, her voice trembling now. "He's taken the blame to spare me suspicion, but I swear, Vicar, I had no part in this." Her words carried a desperate edge, and I sensed an opportunity to push harder. "Mrs. Prothero, there are whispers of your closeness to Mr. Redding. Is there truth to them?" Her face flushed, and she turned away, her hands twisting the fabric in her lap. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Yes. Vicar, Lawrence, and I, there was an attachment. We planned to leave St. Mary Mead together, to start anew, but murder, no, we couldn't." Her confession was a crack in the dam, and the words tumbled out. Lucius was unbearable, his control, his cruelty. Lawrence wanted to protect me, so he confessed, thinking it would end the questions. But I was in the woods, I swear it. Her eyes, wet with tears, pleaded for belief, but I recalled Miss Marple's caution about performances. Was Anne's breakdown genuine, or another act? I left the old hall with her confession ringing in my ears, a mix of pity and suspicion warring within me. Anne's admission of an affair with Redding explained his gallant confession, but it also deepened their motive. Had love driven them to murder, with the clock and note as tools to confuse the timeline? I decided to confront Redding, hoping to test Anne's story against his. His studio, a converted barn on the village's edge, was dim, the air thick with paint and turpentine. He answered my knock, his face haggard, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. "Vicar," he said, his tone flat, "come to drag more scenes out of me." I recounted Anne's confession, watching him closely. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "It's true," he said, his voice low. "We loved each other. Prothero was a tyrant, she deserved better. I confessed to keep her out of it, but I didn't kill him, Vicar. I was at my studio by 6:15, as Mrs. Baker saw." His story aligned with Anne's, yet his protectiveness felt too perfect, too rehearsed. "And the pistol?" I asked, recalling its link to him. "It's mine," he admitted, "but I kept it in a drawer here. Anyone could have taken it." His explanation was plausible, but the smudged fingerprints suggested a deliberate attempt to obscure the truth. As I left, I passed Letty's Prothero on the lane, her tennis racket swinging carelessly. "Hello, Vicar," she called, her smile bright but her eyes wary. I asked about her presence at the vicarage, hoping to clarify her role. "Just looking for that brooch," she said, her tone light. "Nothing to do with Father's mess." Her flippancy was jarring, and I mentioned Mrs. Lestrange's sighting at 6:30. Lettice blushed, her composure slipping. "I might have stayed longer than I said," she muttered, "but it's not important, is it?" Her evasion reinforced my suspicion that she knew more than she admitted, perhaps as a witness or an accomplice. I sought Miss Jane Marple's counsel, her cottage a refuge from the village's swirling doubts. She was in her sitting room, a fire crackling softly, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision. "Vicar," she said, her eyes twinkling, "you've been unearthing secrets, haven't you?" What did Mrs. Prothero confess? I shared Anne's admission of her affair and Redding's confirmation, along with Lettice's continued vagueness. Miss Marple listened, her expression thoughtful. "Love is a powerful motive," she said, setting her knitting aside. "Mr. Redding's confession is a knight's gesture, but knights fall for a reason. And Mrs. Prothero, her grief is too polished, her story too thin. The clock, set fast, and the note, so neatly timed they point to a plan, Vicar, one that required two minds." I frowned, puzzled. "You think Anne and Redding killed him together?" She nodded, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Consider the scene, Vicar. The pistol left for all to find, yet with smudged prints. The note written to fix the time at 6:20, when both had witnesses. The clock set to mislead. It's a performance, and performances need players. Mrs. Prothero could have slipped into the study at 6:10, shot her husband, and left the pistol for Redding to claim. His confession then muddies the waters, giving her an alibi. Her logic was chillingly clear, and I saw the pieces falling into place. Anne's presence near the vicarage, Redding's protective lie, the clock's deception, and Lettice. I asked, thinking of her shifting story. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A careless girl, but careless girls see things. She was at the vicarage longer than she admits perhaps. She saw something, or was persuaded to stay silent. And Mrs. Lestrange, her watching is a distraction, I think, though her motives are her own. Her dismissal of Mrs. Lestrange surprised me, but her focus on Anne and Redding was compelling. I thanked her and left, the wind now howling through the village, as if echoing the storm within me. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Slack was waiting, his face a mix of triumph and frustration. "Mrs. Prothero's in trouble," he said, brandishing his notebook. "Lestrange's story saw her near your gate at 6:10, clear as day. And Redding's sticking to his confession, but his timeline's shaky with the clock fixed. They're hiding something, Vicar." I shared Anne's admission of the affair, and Slack's eyes lit up. Motive aplenty, then lovers plotting to be rid of the old man. "We'll bring her in for questioning." His haste worried me, but the evidence was mounting. That evening, I sat in the drawing room, Griselda beside me, her face pale. "Len, if Anne and Redding did it, how could they be so cold?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To plan it, to lie so boldly." I had no answer, but Miss Marple's talk of love and deception haunted me. The lovers' plottings shot, Redding's sacrifice, the clock's trick seemed to fit. Yet Lettice's role and Mrs. Lestrange's vigilance gnawed at me. As the wind rattled the windows, I felt the truth drawing closer, a shadow in the heart of St. Mary Mead, waiting to be exposed. Chapter 11. The final clue. The murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero had cast a long shadow over St. Mary Mead, turning its quiet lanes into a maze of suspicion and deceit. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this once tranquil parish, felt as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, the truth tantalizingly close yet obscured by a web of lies. The discovery that the study clock had been set fast, placing the murder at 6:10, had unraveled the alibis of Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero, whose confessed affair provided a motive as compelling as it was scandalous. Miss Jane Marple, keen insights about the note's deliberate placement, The clock's manipulation and a conspiracy born of love had guided my inquiries, while Mrs. Lestrange's revelation of seeing Anne near the vicarage at the critical hour had tightened the noose. Yet questions lingered. What was Lettice Prothero's role, and why had Mrs. Lestrange watched so closely? The village, with its relentless gossip, seemed to both conceal and reveal, and I sensed the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. The morning was bleak, a cold drizzle cloaking St. Mary Mead in a grey veil that mirrored the uncertainty within me. Griselda, pale and anxious over breakfast, spoke of the village's fevered speculation. "Len, everyone's talking about Anne and Readying now," she said, her voice low. "They say it's a lover's plot, but it's so ruthless. Could they really have planned it all?" Her doubt echoed my own, and I recalled Miss Marple's words about love's power to blind and bind. The evidence reading's confession, Anne's presence near the vicarage. The tampered clock pointed to their guilt, yet I felt an unease, as if a vital detail remained hidden in plain sight. I decided to revisit the vicarage garden, where the open study window had allowed the killer's entry. The police had trampled the flower beds, but the scene was otherwise unchanged, the hedge low and the path soft with rain. As I stood by the window, imagining the murderer's silent approach, a glint in the mud caught my Arjar small silver brooch, its pearl gleaming faintly. Lettice's brooch, the one she claimed to have lost. My heart quickened. Her presence in the garden, dismissed as trivial, now seemed significant. Had she dropped it while fleeing, or watching something she shouldn't have? I pocketed the brooch, determined to confront her, but first I sought Miss Marple's counsel, knowing her sharp mind could illuminate this new clue. Her cottage was a haven of warmth, the scent of baking scones mingling with the crackle of a fire. She welcomed me with a smile, her knitting needles already in motion. "Vicar," she said, her eyes twinkling, "you've found something, haven't you? Come, tell me." I showed her the brooch, explaining its discovery near the study window. Her expression grew thoughtful, her needles pausing. "Miss Prothero's brooch," she murmured. "How interesting. She was there longer than she admitted, and closer to the scene than we thought. But is she a witness, or something more?" I shared my suspicion that Lettice had seen or done something significant, and Miss Marple nodded, pouring tea with a steady hand. "The garden is the key, Vicar," she said. "That window, so conveniently open, and the hedge, so low anyone could slip in unnoticed. But consider the footprints. The police found none, thanks to the dry ground that day, but a woman's shoe, small and light, might leave a fainter mark than a man's boot." Her words sparked a memory. Hadn't Slack mentioned a faint impression near the window, dismissed as irrelevant? I asked her to elaborate, and she leaned forward, her voice soft but incisive. "Suppose, Vicar, that Mrs. Prothero entered the study at 6:10, shot her husband, and left the pistol for Mr. Reading to claim. The note, written in a crude imitation of the Colonel's hand, was placed to fix the time at 6:20, when both had witnesses. The clock, set fast, sealed the illusion. And let us perhaps she saw it all, or part of it, and her brooch marks her presence. Her theory was chillingly precise, aligning with the evidence, yet hinging on a single, delicate clue. Brooch. But why would Lettice stay silent? I asked. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Youth is loyal, Vicar, especially to those they admire. Lettice may have seen Mrs. Prothero, or even helped her out of pity or persuasion, or perhaps she fears what she knows. Her suggestion of Lettice's complicity stunned me, but the brooch's discovery made it plausible. I thanked her and left. Determined to confront Lettuce and test Miss Marple's theory, the old hall was hushed, its grandeur dimmed by the drizzle. Mrs. Reeves showed me to the conservatory, where Lettuce was arranging flowers with a restless air. "Hello, Vicar," she said, her smile brittle. "More questions about father?" I produced the brooch, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened, her fingers faltering on a rose stem. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. "In the vicarage garden, near the study window," I said, my tone firm. "You were there longer than you claimed, Lettuce, and closer to the scene. What did you see?" Her face paled, and she sank onto a chair, her composure crumbling. I didn't mean to lie," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I was looking for the brooch, but then I saw someone near the window. I got scared and ran, but I didn't tell anyone because it didn't seem real." Her words were halting, and I pressed gently. "Who did you see, Lettuce?" She bit her lip, tears welling. "It was Anne," she said at last. "She was by the window, looking inside. I thought she was just checking on father, but then I heard the shot, and I ran." Her confession was a thunderbolt, confirming Mrs. Lestrange's sighting and Miss Marple's theory. "Why didn't you tell the police?" I asked. She shook her head, sobbing now. "I didn't want to hurt Anne. She was so kind to me, and father was so awful. I thought maybe she didn't mean it." Her loyalty to Anne was heartbreaking, but it sealed the case's heart. I comforted her, promising to speak to Inspector Slack, and left, my mind racing. Anne's presence at the window, the shot, the brooch all pointed to her guilt, with Redding's confession as her shield. I hurried to the police station, where Slack was sifting through reports, his face etched with frustration. "Vicar," he said, "unless you've got proof, I'm up to my ears." I shared Lettuce's confession and the brooch, watching his eyes light up. "That's it, then," he said, scribbling furiously. "Mrs. Prothero at the scene, readying covering for her. We'll bring her in." I urged caution, fearing Lettuce's youth made her an unreliable witness, but Slack was undeterred. "We've got Lestrange's sighting, the clock, the pistol now. It's enough." I left, uneasy but convinced the case was nearing its end. To confirm my suspicions, I visited Anne at the old hall, hoping to gauge her reaction. She was in the library, a book unopened in her lap, her face pale but serene. "Vicar," she said, rising, "you look troubled. What's happened?" I mentioned Lettuce's confession, watching her closely. Her composure shattered, her hands trembling as she sank back into her chair. "Lettuce saw me," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen. Lucius was unbearable, his cruelty unending. Lawrence and I wanted to be free, but I never planned to kill him. It was a moment's madness. I took the pistol from Lawrence's studio, went to the vicarage, and it happened so fast. Her confession poured out, a torrent of guilt and fear. Lawrence confessed to protect me, but I couldn't let him take the blame. The note I wrote it, mimicking Lucius's hand to make it seem he expected someone else. The clock I set it fast, hoping to confuse the time. Her words confirmed Miss Marple's theory, the lover's plot laid bare. I listened, torn between pity and horror, as she described slipping through the garden, shooting the colonel, and leaving the pistol for Redding to claim. Lettuce's brooch, dropped in her panic, was the final clue, a silent witness to the crime. I promised to inform Slack, urging her to surrender herself, and left, my heart heavy. The village was quiet, the drizzle softening its edges, but the weight of Anne's confession lingered like a storm cloud. I returned to Miss Marple's cottage, needing her clarity to anchor me. She was in her sitting room, a fire casting soft shadows, her knitting steady as ever. "Vicar," she said, "you've found the truth, haven't you?" I recounted Anne's confession, Lettice's role, and the brooch's discovery. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Love is a dangerous thing, Vicar," she said. "It drove Mrs. Prothero to murder, and Mr. Redding to lie. The brooch was the final stitch, pulling the pattern together. As for Mrs. Lestrange, she watched, but her secrets are her own, and they don't touch this crime." Her dismissal of Mrs. Lestrange surprised me, but her focus on Anne and Redding was As I walked home, the drizzle turning to rain, Griselda met me at the door, her face anxious. "Len, is it over?" she asked. I nodded, unable to voice the tragedy of it all. The final Cluth brooch, dropped in a moment of panic, had unraveled. The lovers' plot, exposing a truth as stark as it was sorrowful, hidden in the heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 12. The quiet of St. Mary, Mead. The revelation of Anne Prothero and Lawrence. Redding's guilt in the murder of Colonel Lucius. Prothero had brought a sombre resolution to the turmoil that had gripped St. Mary Mead. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this once placid parish, felt the weight of the tragedy settle over me like a heavy fog. Even as the village began to exhale, its fevered gossip giving way to a stunned silence. The discovery of Lettice Prothero's brooch near the vicarage study window, coupled with Anne's tearful confession, had unravelled a carefully orchestrated plot complete with a tampered clock, a forged note, and a sacrificial confessional. Driven by a desperate love, Miss Jane Marple's unerring insight had guided me through the maze of deception. Yet the truth, now laid bare, left a bitter taste. The village, so quick to judge, now faced the reality of its own complicity in weaving a narrative of suspicion. And I wondered if St. Mary Mead would ever regain its former innocence. The morning after Anne's confession was crisp, the sky a pale blue that seemed to promise renewal, though the air held a lingering chill. Griselda, her usual spark dimmed by the case's grim conclusion, sat across from me at breakfast, her eyes fixed on the window. "Len," she said softly, "it's over, isn't it? But it doesn't feel right, somehow. Anne and Redding, they did something terrible, but I can't help feeling sorry for them." Her words mirrored my own conflicted heart. Anne's act, born of desperation to escape the Colonel's tyranny, and Redding's willingness to take the blame to shield her, were as tragic as they were criminal. Yet the murder had been meticulously planned. A betrayal of the villagers' trust that left me shaken. Inspector Slack had acted swiftly, arresting Anne and Redding that very evening. The police station, a squat building usually quiet, buzzed with activity as the news spread. Anne, pale but composed, had surrendered without protest, her confession to Slack echoing what she had told me: the stolen pistol, the shot fired in a moment of rage, the note forged to mislead, the clock set fast to secure their alibis. Redding, defiant to the last, had admitted his role in the cover-up, insisting he had acted to protect Anne. The village, quick to seize on scandal, was now abuzz with a new kind of talk, not of suspicion, but of pity and shock. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Price Ridley, usually so eager to condemn, spoke in hushed tones, her pince-nez glinting as she murmured, "Poor Mrs. Prothero, roven to it by that brute of a man." I felt compelled to visit Lettice Prothero, whose reluctant confession about seeing Anne at the vicarage had been the final key to the truth. The old hall, stripped of its patriarch, seemed emptier. its grandeur hollowed by loss. Mrs. Reeves, the housekeeper, showed me to the conservatory, where Lettice sat, a sketchbook in her lap, her pencil idle. "Hello, Vicar," she said, her voice subdued, her eyes red from crying. "I suppose you're here about Anne." I nodded, sitting across from her, and gently returned her brooch, its silver and pearl gleaming in the morning light. "You dropped this in the vicarage garden," I said. "It helped us find the truth." Lettice took the brooch, her fingers trembling. "I didn't want to hurt her," she whispered. "Anne was always kind to me, unlike father. When I saw her by the window, I thought she couldn't have meant it. But then I heard the shot, and I ran. I should have told someone sooner." Her guilt was palpable, and I comforted her, assuring her that her honesty had been crucial, though it could not undo the tragedy. "Will they hang her, Vicar?" she asked, her voice breaking. I had no answer, only a heavy silence, and I left her to her grief, the weight of her youth and loyalty pressing on me. The village was quieter now, its rhythms resuming with a tentative air. I decided to seek Miss Jane Marple's perspective, knowing her wisdom would help me make sense of the aftermath. Her cottage, with its vibrant roses and lace-curtained windows, was a sanctuary of calm. She welcomed me with a smile, her knitting needles clicking softly as she gestured to a chair. "Vicar," she said, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction, "the storm has passed, hasn't it? Though I dare say St. Mary Mead will not soon forget." I recounted Anne's confession, Redding's arrest, and Lettice's tearful admission, and Miss Marple listened, her expression serene. "Human nature, Vicar," she said at last, setting her knitting aside, "is the same in every village. Love, desperation, fear, they lead to the same end. Mrs. Prothero and Mr. Redding thought they could outwit time itself, with their note and their clock. But truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it?" Her words were gentle but incisive, and I marveled at her ability to see through the chaos to the heart of the matter. "And Mrs. Lestrange?" I asked, still puzzled by the woman's watchful presence. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "A curious figure, but not our villain. Her secrets are her own, perhaps a private grievance against the Colonel, or a quest for justice, we'll never know. She played her part, Vicar, by watching and waiting, but the crime was Anne's and Redding's." I nodded, her dismissal of Mrs. Lestrange aligning with my own sense that the woman's role was peripheral, a distraction from the lover's plot. "How did you know, Miss Marple?" I asked. "The clock, the note, the conspiracy, how did you see it all so clearly?" She smiled, pouring tea with a steady hand. "I've lived long enough to see patterns, Vicar. People are not so different from my roses beautiful, but with thorns that prick when you least expect. Anne's composure was too perfect, Redding's confession too noble, and Lettice's brooch is such a small thing, but it told a story. In a village, nothing stays hidden for long." Her words brought a strange comfort, a reminder that even in tragedy, there was order to be found. I asked about the note 620 must, settled the sand, its role in the deception. "A clever touch," she said. "Anne wrote it, I'm sure, to pin the time of death later, when she and Redding had witnesses. The clock, set fast, was her ally, but Lettice's brooch betrayed her presence. It's always the small things, Vicar, that unravel the grandest plans." Her insight was humbling, and I realized how much I had underestimated her, mistaking her quiet observation for idle curiosity. As I left her cottage, the village was settling into its evening routines, children playing on the green, the milk cart rattling down the lane. I stopped by the church, seeking solace in its familiar walls. The pews were empty, the air cool and still, and I knelt briefly, praying for Anne, unreadying, for Lettice, and for St. Mary Mead itself. The scandal would linger, I knew, but the village had a resilience that would see it through. Back at the vicarage, Griselda was waiting, her face softer now, a hint of her usual spark returning. "Len, is it really over?" she asked, taking my hand. I nodded, though the weight of the truth remained. "It's over," I said, "but we'll carry it with us." The next day, I visited Inspector Slack at the police station, where he was finalizing reports, his usual brusqueness tempered by a grudging satisfaction. "You stirred things up, Vicar," he said, his eyes narrowing. That brooch was the clincher. Mrs. Prothero's confessed everything shot him with Redding's pistol. Set the clock, wrote the note. Reading planned to take the fall, but she wouldn't let him. Case closed. I asked about Mrs. Lestrange, still curious about her role. Slack shrugged. "She's leaving the village tomorrow. Says her business here is done. Odd woman, but no criminal." His dismissal echoed Miss Marple's, and I let it go, content that the true culprits were in custody. The funeral for Colonel Prothero was held a few days later, a simple affair at the village church. Anne, under guard, did not attend, but Lettice was there, her face pale but composed, supported by Mrs. Reeves. The village turned out in force, their whispers subdued, their faces a mix of curiosity and sorrow. I delivered a brief sermon, speaking of forgiveness and the frailty of human hearts, though my words felt inadequate. Afterward, I walked through the churchyard, the gravestones gleaming in the sunlight, and saw Miss Marple by the gate, her straw hat bobbing as she tended a rose bush. "Vicar," she called, her voice warm, "you've done well to see this through." I thanked her, acknowledging her role in guiding me. "It was your eyes, Miss Marple, that saw what I missed," I said. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I only watch, Vicar. People tell their stories. If you know where to look, St. Mary Mead will heal, you'll see. It always does." Her confidence was a bomb, and I left her to her roses, the village settling back into its quiet rhythm. That evening, as I sat in the vicarage drawing room, Griselda beside me, I reflected on the case's toll. The lover's plotans, desperate act, Redding's sacrifice. Lettice's reluctant truth had exposed the fragility beneath St. Mary Mead's surface. Yet Miss Marple's insight, so easily mistaken for idle chatter, had cut through the deception, revealing a truth as stark as it was sorrowful. The village would move on, its routines resuming. But I knew I would never look at my neighbours or myself the same way again. The quiet of St. Mary Mead, so hard-won, was a fragile peace built on the understanding that even in the smallest places, the human heart could harbour darkness as deep as any city's.